This week's Parsha, we begin the second book of the 5 books of the Torah, the book of Shemot. This book is known to many as Sefer HaGalut VaGeula, the book of exile and redemption. After all, it traces the fledgling Jewish nation, the 12 tribes, the sons of our forefather Yaakov, whose temporary sojourn in Egypt is lengthened, and slowly they are viewed with enmity by the leadership of Egypt. A new king emerges. He is unwilling to recognize the positive contributions of Yosef to Egyptian society. He views the Jewish nation as a threat. Hava nitchak malo is his response. Let us find a smart way to scheme that he with his advisors will be able to ensure that the Jewish people will be subservient to his will. In the process, he is willing to sacrifice Egypt through the various plagues that come, in order to try to eradicate the Jewish people, solve the Jewish problem in his day and age. However, in this process, he awakens the dormant Jewish spirit of a nation who knows their true home is the land of Israel. But it comes through a rude awakening. A number of commentaries, including Rav Hirsch and the Netziv, note that the Jewish nation, which had come to Egypt as a temporary landing point during a famine, had already become part and parcel of the Egyptian nation. The gates of the ghettos of Goshen were opened. Many of these Jews had a dual identity. Some possibly viewed their primary identity, if not their sole identity, as being Egyptian. They held positions of repute. As the Midrashim described, many walked like an Egyptian, talked like an Egyptian, maintaining minimal connections to their Jewish heritage. They viewed themselves, according to this approach, as upstanding Egyptian citizens, forgetting that they were waiting for the magic words of Pakod Pakadati, the words that would tell the Jewish nation that the time has come to return to the land of Israel, to return to who they really are. According to the Midrash, many of the Jews, even after the miraculous plagues, were unable to sever their ties to Egypt. They remained in Egypt, even though that meant utter destruction. The Ramban describes what was the plan of Paro. And he notes that seemingly this hava nitchak malo, this need to scheme, was because Paro recognized that the Jewish people were a loved part of the Egyptian people. And therefore, he couldn't openly just attack the Jewish people. They were innocent members of society. They had done nothing wrong. And therefore, he would need a plan to make them outcasts. He would need to gain legitimacy for his inhumane treatment of the Jewish people. He would need to make them be viewed so negatively by Egyptian society that ultimately all of Egyptian society could sanction and even allow genocide against the Jewish males born and transforming the Jews into a slave nation. This was done through the means of old. This was done by making them hated. Paro's goal was to divide and disconnect the Jews from their Egyptian counterparts. However, what he failed to recognize is that anyone who does so runs the risk, which he did, of awakening the inner calling of the Jewish nation. One who deep inside recognizes that, although he might live in Egypt, he is not an Egyptian. He has a different identity, a Jewish identity. His home is not Egypt, but rather the land of Israel. Specifically, when a new king is born, and the Torah describes, Vayihi bayamim harabim hahem, Vayamat melech Mitzrayim, after the Jewish people were treated and subjected to utter depravity. They were made into slaves, working back-breaking labor. And the king dies. But yet the work continues. The Jewish people groan from their difficulties. And now, Vayizaku, they call out to God. And in the process, God hears their cries and sends a redeemer in motion. The Ramban asks, why is it now that the Jewish people call out to God? And he notes that once you have an evil king, so many people will rationalize to themselves, it's just this king. The second this king, this Paro dies, so the next Paro will realize the contributions of the Jewish people of the past, and he will essentially bring us back. He will cancel all these decrees against the Jewish people. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. The Jewish people realize that it is now Egyptian policy. Jews are outcasts. They are meant to be treated differently. And this causes that rude awakening. Many Jews who initially felt that their neighbors were close friends come to see that anti-Semitism prevails, and the Jewish people in the land of Egypt will never have a safe home. It is specifically amongst this context that Moshe, the one who had grown up in the palace of Paro, who himself became an outcast after he defended the Jewish people against the Egyptian onslaught, when he is far away from his people, many years later, God appears to him and he says, "You are the one to redeem the Jewish people." But Moshe is aware of the Jewish people from 40 years beforehand. Moshe recognizes that many of these Jewish people had become as close to Egyptians as possible. And he says to God, "Vehem lo ya'aminu li v'lo yishmu b'koli." The Jewish people will not listen to me. What are the chances? However, God responds, as the Gemara notes, that Heim ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim. Do not discount the Jewish people. They're believers, son of believers. You might think that the Jewish nation is incorrigible, but realize that when anti-Semitism arises and the Jewish nation is persecuted, that's what awakens the inner emunah of the Jewish people. And when emunah is awakened, then education is possible. And God is correct. The Jewish people hear and see the signs of Moshe, and they declare that they believe. Moshe soon realizes that redemption is not easy. It's not easy to take a nation who had become Egyptians, to take them out of Egypt, but realize redemption is sometimes a slow process. As the Jerusalem Talmud states, it sometimes happens kima'ah, kima'ah, little by little, like the rising sun. However, it is a process that will happen. The sun will definitely come up tomorrow, and redemption will be complete. While the Torah in this week's Parsha and the ensuing book of Shemot describes the Jewish nation of old, this is a story that is relevant in every generation. And it's not hard to see how it's very relevant to us. The attacks against the Jews in the land of Israel on October 7th are not so different than attacks against the Jewish people throughout the world. Where anti-Semitism has raised its ugly head in universities, in communities, sometimes allowing people to realize that individuals they thought were their greatest friends actually would love to throw them into the sea. But it is here that we recognize Anachnu ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim. Amidst these calls to separate oneself from the Jewish people, Jews throughout the world, and the modern exiles, sometimes realize we are different. And it's amongst this realization that education is possible. And therefore, amongst these difficult times that we find ourselves in, I hope we remember the messages of that inner heart of the Jewish people, the inner identity, the recognition of who we are and what we stand for, and how anti-Semitism, sometimes attempted to be used against the Jewish people, often reminds us who we really are, where our home is. And hopefully it gives us an opportunity to learn more about it, each and every one of us, and to connect more to our heritage and who we are. Have a wonderful Shabbat and help us all feel those flings of redemption. Shabbat Shalom.